First, I want to welcome you. This is our first stab at creating this Zoning 101 code class. And the reason that we're doing this is a couple. One is that last year, the OKCMAR Board of Directors, when they were doing their strategic planning process, realized that one of the things they thought we could improve as an organization is the way we do our advocacy. And what they meant by that is that right now, we pretty much have been reactionary. So if the city came up with the policy, whether it's Oklahoma City, Piedmont, Yukon, or Mustang, we reacted to whatever it is they were proposing. And they wanted to do something different. They wanted to become advocates. They wanted us to be on the floor of the conversation and help influence whatever was going to be proposed for a vote. And as part of that process, we realized that one of the areas where a lot of issues come up for the municipalities is zoning and code updates. And when those changes are being made, we sometimes don't always have the expertise in order to have conversations and to be able to advocate or respond for specific initiatives. So we thought one of the ways that we could help with that is to try to train up as many of our members as we possibly can. We don't expect you to be zoning coding experts, but what we wanted you to be is familiar enough that when a conversation was occurring, you would know what a PUD is. You would know what an overlay is. You would understand what those conversations are about instead of scratching your head as I'm totally lost. I don't know what they're doing. So that's the reason for this. And we're really excited because Oklahoma City is in the process of doing a code update. So our timing both on the advocacy side and the importance of educating our membership is perfectly timed because it gives us as an organization an opportunity to not create an army, because I don't want to scare anybody, but to create a group of people within our organization that could be able to have these kinds of conversations in a way that are meaningful and beneficial, hopefully in influencing whatever recommendations come about. I also wanted to let you know, as part of that is OKCMAR is starting to engage in three important things. One, you probably have already picked up with Oklahoma City doing the code update that we are planning to be very involved in that conversation because it has a direct impact on pretty much everything we do. I mean, think about it. Zones and codes related to housing development, how cities and different areas of the city is planned out. All of that is in there, and being able to participate in a major update that hopefully, and they'll tell you the timeline next year, we think is awesome. Second, the planning division for the city of Oklahoma City has been doing some phenomenal stuff in the last couple of years. And even though COVID has put some of us on ice and we haven't been able to do a lot, they have continued to do their work. And two major things that they have done besides this code update that's occurring now is you may have hopefully been informed and paid attention that they did a homeless study that resulted in a homeless plan of action that the city is in the process of implementing right now. And as part of that, we want to be advocates and supporters of those plans because they impact a segment of our community that is experiencing homelessness. Something that I learned that just blew me away, and this is something I think that you will find interesting. When we're standing out on the or when we're driving around the city or we're going into a store and we see people that are homeless with their sign says, I could really use a couple bucks, or can you spare some change, or, you know, I'll work for food or something like that. For many of us, that's who we think of as being homeless, but they represent less than 20% of the homeless population. The people that really are part of what I call the homeless demographic are people that are transitioning in and out of homelessness. So about 80% of these people you never see, but they're individuals who need services and programs in order to help them through a challenging part of their life. Those are the kinds of programs and services that we want to really actively be engaged in, because we're wanting to ensure that anyone that unfortunately experienced that particular challenge has opportunities available that will support them until they're able to get into some type of stable housing. Second is, you may remember last year, they had done a phenomenal job with an affordable housing study. And the city of Oklahoma City is getting ready to present a potential implementation plan that will be brought forward to the city council. And with that, they're going to need support from an organization like ours as some of those initiatives and recommendations are being implemented. Because if you haven't figured out, there's a theme in everything we do, and it's called money. And money plays a major part in what we can do and what we can't do. So part of our advocacy is not only on policies, but to figure out strategies in order to get money from, whether it's the city budget, the state budget, the federal budget, or in the homeless programs, just fundraising, that we get resources, i.e. money, in places where they're desperately needed. So if you don't know, my name is Gary Jones. I'm the Government Affairs Director for OKCMAR, and very proud to represent you, because you guys are a phenomenal group of people who speak by your actions, by the fact is that through our political action committee, and the fact that you attend and support us on these policy initiatives really helps us as we try to improve the quality of life in our community. Next, I'm going to introduce you to Jessica Thompson. Jessica Thompson is Vice Chair of our Government Affairs Committee, but she also is chair of our policy committee. So much of what we do is based on policy. She's going to give you a little overview about zoning, and then we're going to introduce our guests who have created this phenomenal program for you today. Without any further ado, and I know I went over my timeline, Jessica Thompson.
Thank you, Gary. I'm so excited this year. Okay, so if you're not familiar, planning is a visionary concept. It's not enforceable. Zoning is regulatory and therefore enforceable. So it's really important to know the difference between the two. The city already has done their comprehensive plan, and now we're working on the code update. So that being said, the zoning must be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And what the comprehensive plan does is it looks at housing, transportation, natural resources, and recreation. So in planning, you make an objective, then a goal, and then you have zoning, which is the policy. So there are two forms of zoning seen across the country. You have Euclidean zoning and form-based zoning. Oklahoma City, right now, we have Euclidean zoning. Euclidean, EUCLIDEAN. And the predecessor to Euclidean zoning was nuisance laws. Courts determined zones acceptable and prohibited, and it got to the point where this was too much, so zoning was implemented. Euclidean zoning was a response to harmful living conditions, responding to people living near industrial plants, New York City, for example, back in the early 1900s. Immigrants lived in overcrowded apartments. There was exposure to loud noises, dust. It's just, the quality of life was not great. So it was an extreme response that was adopted across the country. All states have zoning enabling legislation, some modeled after the standard state zoning enabling act, which was developed by the U.S. Department of Commerce of the 1920s. The enabling act authorizes city and municipalities to adopt zoning, and many states allow municipal home rule to allow for counties. So that being said, I'm going to introduce Lisa Cronister with the city of Oklahoma City, and she's going to take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica and Gary, for having us. We are thrilled to be here to talk about this project. As both Gary and Jessica alluded to, a big part of why we are here is not just to inform you, but for us to be informed by what you know from your work. So we want your input toward the end. So next slide. So I am joined today here in person by Marilyn Lamensdorf. She's a program planner in our office, and she is the project manager for the code update project. Also joining us online, who you'll hear from a little bit later, is Mark White with White and Smith Planning and Law Group, and Brett Keast with Kendig Keast Collaborative in Sugar Land, Texas. If any of you were involved in our sign code update that we've been working on the past 2 years, this is the same consultant team, and they're going to see us through the whole rest of the zoning code. So today we'll kind of tell you, what our existing zoning code entails. We'll talk about why at this juncture does the code need to be updated. We'll talk through some key code terms that you may be familiar with and have no idea what they mean. You may be completely unfamiliar with them. So we hope with that understanding, it'll help you be engaged going forward. Then we'll discuss our new zoning code approach. It's important to realize when we do that yes, as Gary was saying, we and our consultants have been working a lot during the pandemic. We've had many focus groups. We have a stakeholder advisory team. We have a policy committee, and we have arrived at a basic framework for the new code. But everything about the specifics of this new code is still very much in development. So this is exactly the right time that we need input from people who have interest and knowledge in the various subtopics. Most importantly, like I said, we want you to know how you can be involved and stay involved. The code update process began in 2017 with what was called phase 1 diagnosis that was done by a separate consultant, and then the current consultant team was hired in 2019, and we expect our work to be mostly finished by the end of 2023. So it's a very long process. Part of why it has to be long is because it has to be thorough, and there's a lot of information to solicit and communicate to you and other groups during that time. So with that, I will hand it over to Marilyn for our next section.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We are excited to be here. So I get to kind of expand on what Jessica said, some planning terms and about our current code. So I'll just be talking about our current code. And so you can see sort of where we're going after that with the consultants. So we'll jump in after that. So we have had a zoning code since 1923, about the time when the Zoning Enabling Act was passed, or upheld by the Supreme Court, really. So that was the first time Oklahoma City adopted a zoning code. And we then updated again in 1948 because we had this new thing called the car that we had to figure out where to park it and how to park it and make sure everyone was safe. And then in 1980, like many cities across the country, there was new planning ideas abounding, and many cities across the country updated their zoning ordinances, and many ordinances around the country that you find are basically from the 1980s. And I'll show you some ways that's kind of funny, that makes it funny now. But and then in 2007, we updated the code again to incorporate some of the things about our special districts, like Plaza District and Paseo, and things we wanted to preserve, and also to improve our landscaping rules. So that was the first time we really had comprehensive landscape rules in 2007. So as you can see, really our code's been updated about every 25 years in our city's history. So it's about time for a new one. And really that's generated by like what Gary and Jessica and Lisa were saying is our Plan OKC comprehensive plan. How many were involved in that process? Anybody?
Oh, come
It's-
on. I'm the only one.
Okay, thank you, Gary. No, a lot of the input took place from 2012 to 2015 while that plan was being adopted. So, so here we go, number 5 in our city's history, and we hope that this time around it's going to be a source of vitality and strengthened by inclusion in environmental preservation, economic viability, and really a better city for our children and our grandchildren. Because by the time we get this thing adopted and people start building under it, it really could be about 10 years. So I look at this as a plan for our children and grandchildren, and at whatever stage that may be. So, all right. So what is in the code now? Don't fall asleep. So it's a little bit much, but so we have these things in the code now. I'm going to kind of go through some of them, but we'll be looking at all of these different articles for changes and combinations, and really we're trying to make this easier. So the next slide is the key zoning terms. And I was told y'all can't get out of here and you can't get your C's unless you have a key zoning term slide. So some of you might already know some of these things, but we'll just go over them quickly. So accessory dwelling unit, that's a kind of a term that's very hot topic right now, as you probably know. And what it is, it's just a smaller residential dwelling located on the same lot. And it can be standalone or it can be assessed from the principal building. But it is like an accessory building. Bulk dimensional standards, that term you'll want to know a lot because we go by bulk regulations a lot, and these are size, setbacks of buildings, where the building is located on the lot, and lot sizes, lot widths, how far from the side or rear property you have to be, how high the building can be, and where the parking is located. So we have these kind of site design standards that have to be, implemented now on a site. The next term is density. I said this isn't a complete list of terms, but it is A to Z. So, so density, normally when we talk about density, we're talking about residential density. It's a metric that provides a number of units allowed on a property, usually measured in the number of dwellings per acre. So you'll see DU/acre. So that's how many units would fit on an acre, but normally we're dealing with tiny, quarter acres. So that would be like divided in 4, right? And it's kind of a way of us planners envisioning the differences between lots, because you can have, if you had 4 units on a quarter acre lot, that's 25 dwelling units per acre. It doesn't sound like that much, but it is. And so in Oklahoma City, we generally range from 0.2 dwelling units per acre way out, in the rural areas, to 100 dwelling units per acre downtown. New York City has way higher than that, but that's sort of our range. The next term that you're going to hear a lot in the code update is called LUDA. And it's land use typology area. This came out of Plan OKC, and I'll explain a little bit more about this in a minute, but it delineates the amount of intensity per area. There's a rural LUDAs, urban LUDAs, and then we get to downtown. So it's how do those differ? What do we want to see? What's our vision for the future for each of those areas? There was a lot of input on that during those 3 years the plan was being developed. Then we have missing middle. I'm sure you're hearing this a lot more too. It's also kind of a new planning term that keeps coming up. And it's really kind of the way housing was built in the 1920s, just kind of, organically, you would have a house and then you would have the back house, probably for the horse carriage. And then there would be another house in between mid-block. So if you go down in some of the core, like I was looking at Blackwelder the other day on the north-south streets, you'll see, and you don't even notice it when you drive by, but there's a house in the middle. So you think that's a R1 lot with just, one house per per lot, but it's not, it's really 2 because there was this little house in the mid block. And that's the condition in a lot of places in the core. Street typology, that's another Plan OKC term that you'll hear. These are terms kind of, for Oklahoma City that you won't find these in all cities, but so in Plan OKC, we also delineated different types of streets like arterials, the big fast streets like May Avenue and Northwest Expressway and those kind of streets. And then we have connector streets, which are more like Villa, a little bit less intensity, a little less speed. And then you have your local streets, which are your neighborhood streets. So we'll have these typologies, and in the plan, it explained, okay, we want this much street width for cars, we want this much sidewalk, we want this much street trees or whatever. So there's a typology that makes up, that goes behind this, but we don't have a way to enforce that now. So we're working on that in the code update. Subdivision is the term for when you split up a lots into, or split up a big section into smaller lots, or even you can have a subdivision on one lot, say a commercial subdivision. And that's also the word plat. That's the same thing, subdivision and plat. And then we have use units, and you'll hear also a lot about these. These are sort of definitions of like restaurant, medical office, all these things. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So we're going to be focusing a lot on use units in the code update. And then we have the term zone. It's an assignment of metrics and rules and categories for all the land in the city. So right now we have R1, R2, R3, C1, C2, C3. These are zones. We're trying to take out the word district, because every time we start talking about district, they go, do you mean the Plaza District? No. So we're just going to use the word zone throughout this code, so we're not confused, and we'll still have our special districts. So they'll be called districts. So next slide is, okay. So I'm gonna kind of go through these a little bit fast, Mark. Mark's advancing the slides back there. So what's in the code now? So start with base zones, and these are the basic building blocks of the code. And I'll tell you what our base zones are now, and you might already know this. You can see it runs from AA, which is agriculture, to different types of residential, to different types of commercial and industrial. We have 26 base zones right now. Next slide. So these are the residential ones that you might be familiar with. We have rural ones, AA, which is agricultural zone, RA, which is kind of rural lots 1 acre, and RA2, which is rural lots 2 acre. Those are generally 1 to 5 acre lots. Then we have our R1 zone, which is generally 6,000 square foot lots. You can do more than that, but you can't do less. And then R1ZL, which is kind of our patio home, 4,000 square foot lots. And again, you could do more in any of these zones, but you can't do less. Then we have R2, R3, and R4. Those are for more than 1 unit on a lot. We have R2 and R3 is, you can do a 5,000 square foot lot, but all the units have to be attached. So there's no ability to do a detached, like 2 units on a lot. You have to do a duplex or a triplex. Then we get to our R4, and it can be attached or detached. So it can be, townhomes and apartments and things like that. But it has some limits. You have to have a minimum lot width of 100 feet. And so you see the photo. Can you see the photo over? Shoot. Well, these are, you can't see them, but they're townhomes that were built at like 27th and McKinley, 25th and McKinley. And there's 4 of them, and you're like, wow, there's 4 of them. Why is there 4 of them? Four separate ones. Well, they did an SPUD, simplified planning and development. So I'll talk about in a minute. But basically, they needed an R4 zone to have the properties, the houses not attached. So that's the way we work now in residential. In office, we just have kind of three zones. O1, which is kind of your small type office, O2, a bigger office, and then we have a technology park, which would be more like your Dell campus, those kind of things. Then we have commercial zones, and we have 7 different types of commercial zones right now. And you can sort of see the examples of how they kind of increase in intensity. We don't really use the C4 anymore, but there's a lot of areas zone C4, including like a lot of Classic Boulevard and a lot of the stuff, over off like Linwood Diagonal. That was sort of, industrially, kind of half industrial, half commercial. And then we have our neighborhood business, which doesn't require parking and is more for like the Plaza District and things like that. We actually have an old district called CCBD, which was at one time, I think, downtown, right? But the only places left that are CCBD are Capitol Hill, and which was, a second downtown a long time ago. And then there's a couple of things over here by kind of Clark Crew. Those are zone CCBD. I guess we envisioned, little Houston or something. And then we have, which is fine. And then we have our kind of rural commercial zone for out in the rural areas. And then industrial, again, kind of 3 type of zones. I1, it's a building like that where everything has to be inside. You can't store anything outside or do any work outside. I2 has some outside work and storage, and then I3 is more your heavy industrial noise, smoke, dust, odor things. Then we have our special districts, which we have 20 of these. And they're kind of for areas where we wanted a little bit more regulation. And we have design commissions that review this work a lot of times. So on the left side is our these are all base zones actually right now. So we have a downtown base zone, a brick town, HP, which is historic preservation, neighborhood conservation, which is a little area around Paseo, and then Stockyards City. And then on the right side, we have overlays that are, for our shopping district, our special shopping districts, Asian District Plaza, Lincoln Boulevard, Uptown 23rd, Paseo and Capitol Hill. Those are all called urban design, UD, we call them. Northeast 23rd has another overlay. We have urban conservation districts, which are for neighborhoods. In the 80s, when we didn't have landscape regulations and we didn't have a lot of stuff, some of the neighborhoods got together and formed their UCDs. And this is like Gatewood, Linwood, Shepherd. Linwood. You can see on the map. I don't know what color, I guess the green, but not all are green because they're in the stock. SRODD is Scenic River. That's another overlay. Manufactured home parks, and then the airport even has an overlay, AE, and we won't be messing with them at all because they have their rules and we have to abide by them.
So Marilyn, why don't you explain what an overlay is?
Oh, perfect. Okay. So we have the base zones, which include all those R1, R2, R3, C1, C2, C3, I, and then these are base zones. But then on top, you see how it's kind of colors on top, which is very confusing, is extra rules and extra elements of review to make sure that whatever was desired in those zones is occurring. So it's an overlay. They still have base zones underneath, like Northeast 23rd is a lot of C3, sometimes C4. I can't remember all the zonings over there. So they still have their underlying base zone that tells you some things you can do, but then it has stuff on top where it says, but also you can't have this or you should do this.
So like in Gatewood, an example of an overlay would be like, you can't concrete driveway your whole front yard. You can only do a single drive. So that would be an overlay for Gatewood. That's why it's also really important for us realtors to disclose if a house is in, Gatewood or Cleveland or Linwood, because people that are flipping or remodeling homes, they need to know this stuff because it'll come back on us if we didn't make sure that they knew that. So
Okay, and then Gary mentioned that we have what we call Puds and Spuds, and this doesn't have anything to do with baked potatoes, even though sometimes we say that, you know. But PUDs are planned unit developments, and SPUDs are simplified planned unit developments, and many cities have these. But we have come to rely on these a lot more than other cities. And like it's here, in order to do a PUD, you have to have a land application that's greater than 5 acres. And then the simplified PUD is for less than 5 acres. And these are individually negotiated, basically base zones for each little piece of property. And so like, say if you're a realtor and this has a PUD on it, you might not know what it says, and it's kind of hard to find. We've been doing them since 1980 probably, and or maybe before that. And you got to go back and dig in and do an open records request and find out what that PUD says. And sometimes it hasn't ever been developed. And maybe they don't even want to develop it that way anymore, but it has this base. So really, instead of having, what I say, I don't know, like 40 zoning codes, we have like, there's like 2,500 of these. So we really have 2,500 plus 26 zoning codes, which is really tough. What's the next slide? I think I broke it down. Yeah, so in our base districts, how much do we have of each? And so you can see, because we are such a big city, we're so large, we're 620 square miles, which is one of the largest cities in the country for sure. And so we're 45% agricultural, AA, which when I ran the numbers, I was like, wow, I didn't realize that. But it's just so large, and a lot of the areas around are agricultural. The next is single family, which is, you might have heard on the news, which is kind of common throughout the country. And then we're only 1% multifamily, and then this is of the whole 621 square miles, the PUDs are 13%, which is really high for a city.
What's your measurement on the number of parcels?
It is the acres. Yeah. The acres. Yeah. So of our 360,000 acres of zoned land, and so this doesn't include stuff in the county that's not part of Oklahoma City, 45% of all the acres are, but that's a good point, because if you ran it by parcels, maybe it's a little different. I don't know. I could run it that way and see. Good point. So if we take out all the kind of rural areas and we talk about the urbanized area, the next slide, Mark. How do we compare, say, with other cities? Are we normal, or are we not normal? And you can see we're pretty normal. We're 40 inside the core. We're not inside the core, but from not counting the rural areas, we are 40% single family, and San Antonio's pretty similar. We're 8% agricultural. San Antonio is about 15%. San Antonio is a lot like us, where it's a big kind of lots of land mass and lots of driving and stuff. But we only have 4% commercial, and San Antonio is 14%. But look at our PUD. We are 24% PUD, and whereas like a city like San Antonio is only 6%. So we are. And we need to run an analysis. It would take us a while to figure out if these PUDs, all these thousands of PUDs, are residential or commercial, because they could be industrial. They're not all residential. Next slide, Mark. Okay. Yeah. So we have a lot of PUDs and SPUDs. So the next thing, we've gone through the base districts and the special purpose districts, is I would talk about the bulk standards, which we talked about before on the key sheet. And that is sort of how tall, how big, how far back does the building have to be set from the street. Next slide, Mark. Yeah. So for example, the code might have lot coverage. So on like a C3, like a grocery store, you're allowed 100% lot coverage, which is talking about buildings and paving in this code. We have building setbacks, and most everything is 25 feet from the street. across the city, except for downtown where we don't have these same regulations. In a residential zone, your lot coverage is only 50%. So that's why you have the green yards and you can't have more than 50%. And then of course we have building height, where we wouldn't have a building like Devon in the middle of, out here, but there would be measurements for height that have limits on height. And then of course we have our density also as a bulk standard, how many units on an acre. And the next slide. So also we have use units. These are interesting. And if you want to just go online and read the use units, I'll give you a link later. You can just go in the municipal code and search for use units. These are a list of all the residential, commercial, industrial things in the city, and they're classified under each of the zones, like C1, C2, C3, R1, what you can have in each zone. The next slide. So some of these, so we have 118 commercial and industrial uses. That's 25 pages in the code. A lot of these are from 1980s, so that's why it's kind of fun to go back and read. We have things like reducing salons and ticket offices and things that we can't equate now to 2022, wherever we are. So it's kind of fun, but it makes it also kind of hard because some of the uses are just too specific. Like when we came in with scooters all over the place, the drive-through restaurant definition is you must have on-premise and off-premise food consumption. So even though that's kind of like a restaurant, it's not. It's the same classification as a grocery store because it's food sales. And so there's things like that where it's a little too specific. And then there's things that are too vague. Like we have this convenience sales and personal services, which is something under 10,000 square feet, but it's vague of what it is. And then we have personal services general, which I'll show you the next slide, is kind of vague. And you can see why in a minute. So a lot of these things have reflected reactions to uses over the time. So like participant recreation indoor is another funny one. It's billboards, health clubs, and video arcades. And you'll go back and you'll see in old PUDs, we didn't want those hooligans and those video arcades hanging out near us, but now they're in your upstairs bedroom. And so, so times change and notions change, when we look at medical services, it makes me think back to the apothecaries, when you watch some of the 1920s series where they go into the apothecary, and that was kind of a weird, bad thing, kind of like health clubs. And, so things change over time, but we go in and we stuff them into categories. Like look at personal services general, massage parlors, personal trainers, ticket offices, tattoo parlors, all those things we kind of don't like. And then personal services restricted, reducing salons. We don't know what that is. Masonic lodge, meeting halls, travel agents. So it's funny, and so that's what we have right now, which makes it pretty hard for permitting. And it might be, so in our code now, we have, besides use units and bulk regulations and base zones, we have parking regulations, we have landscape regulations, and we have compatibility with adjacent uses. Like if you had an office next to a home, you'd want screening. So on a lot, this is how all this stuff fits together. And so that's sort of why we have zoning, to make sure that everyone's safe. And that's how all the different types of things work together right now. So I think on the next slide, you're doing that. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Marilyn. So next slide. Why are we changing the code? Why are we changing the code now? Next slide. Thank you. Jessica mentioned earlier and Gary said, I was involved in the development of Plan OKC. So it was finished. It was adopted in 2015 next slide. After a very long, exhaustive process of study and outreach, again, with a large team of in-house staff and consultant team. But the point of a comprehensive plan is to document a vision of how a city should grow or not grow. Usually there's a precipitating event for plans like this. Like you might know that your city is shrinking. You might know that something about its economy or industry is changing. For Oklahoma City, it was two things. One, as Marilyn said, it had been about 20 years since the last one, so a generation. But two, census projections were that we were going to grow by hundreds of thousands of people by, I think the target year was 2030. So if you know that as a community, you can plan for it to happen, or you cannot plan. You can hope, right? You can hope there'll be places to live. You can hope that there'll be streets to serve them, or you can actually plan for that to happen. And the last census, I don't remember what the figures are, but the last several have proved that Oklahoma City's population is growing. So there was a lot of community outreach, focus groups. One of the main topics of discussion was this comparison of growth scenarios. So, okay, it was kind of we knew Oklahoma City was probably going to grow. What was the most efficient way for it to grow? Did it make sense to continue building an investment in undeveloped lands? Did it make more sense to densify development where we already had public investment in infrastructure, where we already had streets, utilities, fire stations? Because part of the when we say, how do we know where we should grow? There's a cost to efficiency, right? If you already have the infrastructure, if you already have the street network, if you already have the public safety response times, it's more cost effective to develop in those areas. Does that make sense? So that was the big picture of Plan OKC. And so the result, next slide, was these land use typology areas. So this map is, I told Marilyn I would make this point because she said, I have to make sure you leave with this understanding. It might've been Jessica, but I think it was Marilyn. The LUDA map has lots of colors, and it looks like it's designating certain areas for certain things, and it is, but this is not the zoning map. This is illustrating the result of the comprehensive plan, where it says, okay, we're going to densify toward the core. So downtown there is shown as the densest development in the dark brown and the purple, right? And then outward from that is what we're calling our urban medium areas, kind of our traditional neighborhoods. We call it like the donut. Then outward from there with more suburban development in our urban low areas, but preserving our agricultural areas, not just for agriculture, but a lot of those are environmentally sensitive areas. And they're currently not often served by public sewer. So let's concentrate the development toward previously developed areas. Next slide. Oh, yes.
The map on the previous slide, is there somewhere that if we wanted to go look at that, we can find it?
Yes, you can go to planokc.org and
Thank
click on, I think when you pull up the page, it either says development guide or browse the interactive map. Either one will take you to this. And from there, you can zoom in and out to find your exact property. Again, this map, that map is capturing how the area is conceived to develop going forward. Nothing about it changed anybody's zoning, but we are using it as the basis for our new zoning code. Does that make sense? Okay, so so the LUDAs were one aspect of Plan OKC. It also contains a plethora of policies and ideas to be achieved. These are some of them. You know, we want more transportation connectivity for everybody. We want walkability. And when I say we, I'm not saying the planning department. I'm saying this is collected feedback from all of the engagement. People want to preserve open space. They want to preserve environmentally sensitive areas, more landscaping. You know, we want an attractive city. Maybe increase our design standards. Right now we have those special design review districts, but maybe good design is good design and should be implemented in other parts of the city. Already when this outreach was done, you know, people were asking about, hey, can we have more choices in in housing product? That's probably something you hear a lot in your work. And as a way to get that, could we densify where it is appropriate? Next slide. So since Plan OKC, so that outreach was done mostly between like 2010 and 2015. As we embarked on the zoning code update, we wanted kind of just to touch base with the public, see where everybody was at. So we sent out a resident survey in October of last year. And you know, real simple, just, hey, what are your top concerns? Transportation and connectivity of all sorts were top ranked. You know, everybody wants a good looking city. Everybody wants to be able to walk and drive unimpeded. Flooding, depending on where you live, probably shouldn't surprise anybody. Very concerned, and that's directly affected by new development, right? And then yeah, places to continue to enjoy nature and exercise. Next slide. So Gary referenced the housing market study and the housing affordability study. They too illustrated feedback about housing choice, especially like you know, intergenerational housing choices. You know, does anybody want to mow their big lawn anymore? Maybe not. Yeah, what about ADUs? Their support, again, back to housing choice and maybe smaller dwellings. You know, the trend in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s was bigger and bigger houses, right? But now it partly because of affordability, partly because of just taking care of it, you know, bigger houses. Well, up until the pandemic, the desire for bigger houses was waning, right? Then with the pandemic, everybody wanted an office attached, but that's 89% of homes built, what's this? 89% of homes built in the last 10 years were single family and outside the core. And right, is that well, I was gonna, we'll talk about that later. Hold that thought. Then of course, everybody wants, you know, safety. A hallmark of Oklahoma City is safe, clean, and affordable place to live. So, okay, next slide. So now I'm handing it off to our consultant, Mark White. He's going to tell us, so if those were the desired outcomes from Plan OKC, why can't our existing zoning code achieve those? Mark, it's all yours. So Mark will be, yeah, he's on the upper right talking to you from Kansas City.
There you go. A city a lot like Oklahoma City. Very big, auto dependent, in a lot of ways. And so I think there are a lot of parallels. We even have a streetcar downtown now. So I see a lot of things in common with Kansas City and Oklahoma City. For those of you who've read the zoning code, how many people have? Hands in the air. I can see a few of you.
Thank you, Kimberly.
I hear some people laughing when I ask that. It's chapter 4. It's right now. It's chapter 59 of the city code, or it's called the municipal code, which is online at municode.com. The sign code's currently in chapter 3 of the municipal code, and we are getting ready to move it to chapter 59 as soon as it's adopted. So what I'm going to talk about in a second is, okay, we've got long-range planning policies, as Jessica mentioned right at the beginning. Plans aren't self-executing; they're not enforceable, nor do plans enable things. You know, we're not just looking at new regulations. We're looking at ways to enable things like accessory dwelling units or ADUs, those sorts of things that can unleash the power of the marketplace to meet demands for housing and even to preserve environmental resources, things like that. And what we're finding is that what we have codified today, which you will read in chapter 59, isn't up to the task that's laid out for us in Plan OKC. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why. And here's some of the details. One is a lot of our zoning districts are homogeneous. You look across, for example, minimum lot width here in R1CL, R2, R3, they're pretty similar, 40 to 50 feet. Here you can have two family with different categories. The building height is the same across, the front yard's the same. So if you wanted a product where you have more of a two-family or townhouse style unit that's pulled closer to the street, something that you'd see in a traditional neighborhood that was built in the old days where people walked more as their primary form of transportation, something that's becoming more popular, you couldn't do it. The zoning code requires you to push your house back from the street. And it also forces development outcomes that are very similar regardless of what zoning district you're in. We're looking at a lot of different product types in this code, everything from in your rural and even your suburban areas. Brett will show you how we're looking at maybe an alternative path to what we've seen in the last 50 years, where you get new subdivisions, everything's on large lots. You may get a little playground in the middle with a swimming pool, but you don't have a lot of real open space. Most people don't have access to open space. There's a lot of yards, there's a lot of green space in yards, but we lose a lot of open space that way by pulling back on minimum lot size. Maybe there is an option in that district where we cut back a lot on minimum lot size and allow smaller lots, or we allow a variety of housing types so that we make physical room for some of the environmental resources and some of the hilly terrain, some of the woodlands that were there. The things that people like to look at when they look out at their window. Most people don't like to look at a backyard. They'd rather look at woods. So we're looking at building some of those options into this code so that you could build something like that. It's popular in other communities the size of Oklahoma City. Heck, it's even popular in Oklahoma City now. We're seeing some of these new types of communities come out of the ground from the Wheeler district south of downtown, other places around Oklahoma City and in the state of Oklahoma. We're finding that there's an appetite for different ways of living. The conventional subdivision isn't going away anytime soon, and we're going to accommodate that, but we want to unleash market demands for other products as well, and to get rid of this homogeneity between all the districts. Other standards too force not only a homogeneous development pattern, but they actively force development outcomes that are directly at odds with the long-range planning policies you find in Oklahoma City. One of the biggest culprits is parking regulations. We have one-size-fits-all parking regulations, whether you're at the edge of the city where you need your car or your truck to get from one place to the other, or whether you live within a quarter mile of the streetcar or a higher density neighborhood where you could walk to the grocery store or something like that. All those places require the same parking spaces. Most of those spaces occur in surface parking. Surface parking takes up a lot of land that supplants what used to be either those wooded areas we used to like to look at, or they supplant areas that could have been built for housing, for shops, for storefronts, for places like that. Now they're parking. And what's that parking look like? Well, 364 days out of the year, most of that parking is what? It's empty. It's a giant slab of asphalt that sits empty in the middle of the summer. When it gets over 100 degrees, it bakes and makes the air hotter. And it's not real nice to look at. So that's the downside of parking. Now, we all know that people, need a place to park when they go shopping in Oklahoma City, especially in your suburban areas. But we're looking at taming that and adjusting and calibrating our parking ratios based on where you are. What kind of streets are in front of you? How close are you to places that you work and places you shop and places you play, places that you walk just for recreational purposes, and et cetera. How does this work with unit affordability? Marilyn mentioned up front, missing middle. We're looking at adding new housing products, not just to meet market demands, but also to meet what you heard in that affordable housing study, because not everyone can afford, especially first-time home buyers and people at the lower end of the income spectrum can't always afford that single family home with a yard. So we want to make room for units like that to meet Oklahoma City's growing needs for different households. And also, to make more room for the places we just enjoy being, and not just places to store cars. This image is from that 2016 report. It's a diagnosis of everything I'm telling you about what's wrong with Chapter 59. It's a great read. It's online if you want to go read it. But the city's done several things and has done some patchwork fixes to the shortcomings of what I showed you earlier. What I showed you earlier was what's called Euclidean zoning. Jessica mentioned that up front. There's several different patterns of zoning that we've seen around the country, and the most basic one is Euclidean, or what we call conventional zoning. Euclidean comes from the famous US Supreme Court case that came out of Euclid, Ohio, that upheld the concept of zoning in the United States. And it divides districts into residential, commercial, and industrial, and the two can never meet. And that creates some bad development outcomes, as I talked about earlier. So the city's adjusted that with several patches. One are these overlay districts. Those are design districts that we plop on top of your base districts that maybe let you bring your buildings closer to the street. It prescribes some more detail about what your buildings look like. They don't allow you to pave your entire front yard, as we mentioned in the gateway overlay, for example. And one of the problems with that is the code becomes a really difficult and confusing patchwork of regulations, because you look at your base district and you think you know what the rules of the game are, but sit down, you're not done reading yet. Now you have to read your first overlay district, which may be an urban design overlay, but the city has also sometimes overlaid overlays on top of overlays. So you may have an urban design overlay, and on top of that is your 23rd Street up down corridor overlay. So we're looking at ways to flatten all of that and to bake all of these design standards into the base districts, so that we have one place we need to turn to see what all of the regulations in a zoning district or a zone, I'm sorry, Marilyn, not a zoning district, a zone, are. So we're also trying to make all of these regulations as predictable as we can. We're going to add a lot of graphics to this new code, so you can look at a base district and see what development outcome the city expects there. The second patchwork is the other one that Marilyn and Lisa talked about, which are Puds and Spuds. Puds, as you learned, stand for planned unit development. They also stand for paranoia, uncertainty, and delay. And why is that? Well, because For PUDs, developers, to build something, if you want to build a PUD, you have to go to the planning commission, and then you have to go to city council, and you have to beg for permission. And our planning commission and our city council, I think, are fairly reasonable people, but it's a process, and it's an unpredictable process. It's also unpredictable for people who live near a PUD. So if I'm a neighbor and I'm buying into a community, or you're a realtor and you're selling a house and somebody wants to know what's happening down the street, I guess your only answer is, well, we'll know when the city council approves the ordinance. It also means that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of separate development codes. These Puds and Spuds are like mini development codes, and they all vary the base regulations in one way or another. So it makes the outcome very unpredictable. And as you were shown earlier, the city has a lot of land zone PUD. It has more land zone PUD than the entire city of St. Louis, Missouri. And so that gives you a sense of what it is we're trying to fix. Now, we're not going to undo the PUDs that are there, but going forward, we want the city to rely less on negotiation and more on predictable standards. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're looking at how these regulations have been negotiated through the process. Sometimes they change parking, so we're trying to tame the parking standards and right size those. Sometimes they have to vary the landscaping. We're looking at calibrating the landscaping that's required to where you are in Oklahoma City. The bulk regulations, that's your setback, your coverage, and your building height. Those are varied a lot. So we're aligning those with the character of the community. And the city's given us a great blueprint for that in Plan OKC, because we can go to Plan OKC, we can look at the LUDAs, and we can get a sense of what type of development and what character the city wants for that corner of Oklahoma City. And so that's why we're looking at, and Brett's going to talk a second about the regulations and how we're realigning those. So as I mentioned here, as you saw earlier, this is a recap: 24% of the city, over 2,400 of these separate regulations, 55 square miles, bigger than St. Louis. And so we want to make sure that good development outcomes are not the result of negotiations. They were the result of standards we've all agreed on that end up in your base district regulations. And so that's the objective we're shooting for in the zoning code update. And so Brett, I'm going to turn this over to Brett. Brett's our sub-consultant, and I'm thrilled to have him here. I'm going to embarrass him for a second here. But one thing that Brett's done a lot of, Jessica mentioned earlier, there's two types of zoning in the US. There's conventional, and then there's form-based. Form-based codes are based more on the physical design of buildings than the uses allowed in your district. Brett's partner, Lane Kendig, invented a third kind years ago, back when I was in planning school, called performance zoning, where we talked about impervious cover, metrics like that protected environmental resources. And more recently, Brett and Lane wrote several books on what's called community character, that sort of blends the best of conventional, form-based, and performance codes to deliver development outcomes that are appropriate for all environments. Form-based is great for an urban context, but as you saw, Oklahoma City has a lot of rural land. It has a lot of suburban land, and we want the right set of metrics for all of those areas. And so Brett's done a lot of analysis to calibrate and to adjust a new set of zoning regulations to all of these LUDAs. So I'm going to invite Brett up to the microphone, and he'll tell you how that was done and what we're looking at in terms of realigning the district. So Brett, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the compliments, and good afternoon to everybody. I get to do the fun part. You've heard about, what you've been dealing with, and we're going to be talking about where we're going from here and how we are going to, really reevaluate, rethink, and repurpose a lot of the districts that you have today, so they accomplish on the ground what the plan says is intended to happen. which was backed by a lot of public input and a lot of analysis as the plan OKC was done. So previous, you were introduced to the land use typology areas. You've seen this map to the side. Oklahoma City took a pretty divergent path, beginning with the development of the plan and the adoption of the plan. For years and years, dating all the way back into the mid-1920s, every city has used this, what they call Euclidean approach. It's been explained to you. But this map would generally look like a bunch of different colors, and it would say single family residential, multifamily residential, high density residential, and then the same thing for commercial office and commercial retail. So it took a much different approach, and it was predicated on the use itself. What cities have come to learn over time is that these land uses can vary greatly from place to place, where the use is identical, but its context and its character are wholly different. So as an example, you think about a drive-through restaurant out in the periphery. It's a restaurant. You purchase food there. You can go downtown and have the very exact same thing where there is no drive-through, there's no parking. It's maybe a first floor of a high-rise building. The use is the same, but the context that it's within is entirely different. So the city recognized that and used this LUDA approach. So these different land use typology areas more relate to the intended character of development. And this character refers to different types of environments that, you know, we can create, the different look and feel of different types of neighborhoods. So they're not simply predicated on the use of land, but they're looking more at, you know, the design and the character of that development. And there are metrics that we utilize to, you know, help calibrate these districts to generate those outcomes. Next slide. So this just kind of shows you they are a continuum. And if you were to go out to the far edges of the city limits and start a line and draw a line all the way into downtown, you would basically cross all of these different pie pieces where you begin at the rural-most areas where there is no development except for maybe farmhouses and barns and, you know, natural areas. There's no utilities other than septic systems per se. But as you begin working your way toward downtown, you start seeing more houses. Houses start being closer together. They start being on smaller lots. And then you start getting into, you know, the drive-through restaurants that have large parking lots out front. And as you continue to work your way toward downtown, those building forms and the way parking is handled are much different. So by the time you get downtown, parking may be handled on street. It could be in parking garages. It could be in shared parking. The building consumes much more of the land. So you can kind of see the path from the rural-most areas to the urban-most areas. That is essentially what the LUDA, the land use transition areas, have accounted for. So the approach, the districts, as Mark pointed out earlier, have had a lot of the same standards, even though the districts were intended to accommodate different uses and were intended to be of much different character. You know, character when you drive in one neighborhood to another. If one has very large lots and another has very, you know, tight, compact lots, the character is much different, even though the use might be the same. Your zoning ordinances always had these very generic standards, and they were the same across many, many different. So it made it very difficult to create distinctive areas or areas that really relay a type of place or a specific character. Basically, they drew a box and said within that box, you know, here are the lines that you must build within. And anything after that, you know, pretty much was allowed because it met the zoning. And so that's why the city created design districts and things like that, because the outcomes weren't achieving what everybody expected on the ground. The evolution of zoning in Oklahoma City mirrors that of cities across the country. They all started in the same way, and over the course of time, they've gotten wiser, they've gotten smarter. Of course, things have changed dramatically in our market and affordability, and thus, so therefore, zoning must change along with it. So what we're looking at doing is changing the districts before that would give you an image like you see on the top to an image that you see on the bottom that is much more descriptive of what do we exactly want that outcome to be? Where does it lie within the city? How do people take access to it? Do they walk to it? Do they drive to it? Where do they park? How do the buildings relate to one another? So all those things will be, we call, baked into the districts. We won't need as many overlay districts or outside standards to get those results. We will actually write those standards into the districts. And I should say, in so doing, the whole process can be much simpler, much shorter, streamlined, have less steps in the process, will take a lot less time, and will deliver better outcomes than what you're getting today. So these are the zones that have been referred to. On the far left column are the land use typology areas that come from that map that we showed you in the comprehensive plan. The middle column are the zones, disregard, it says proposed districts. They're the proposed zones that we are looking at drafting as part of this update. And then on the far right are probably some of the district designations that you're used to. If you're, selling homes or property in some of these different zoning areas, you probably have pretty good familiarity with what R1 is and R2, as was discussed earlier. So in some cases, we have the same number of districts. In other cases, we have fewer districts that we do today because we're able to consolidate a lot of those that had a lot of the same standards and a lot of the same uses anyway. When we have fewer districts, the map is much simpler. There's many less required processes to rezone property, therefore smaller agendas, less meetings to attend, less costs, so forth. So I'm going to break down these different categories based on the LUDAs as we proceed in this presentation and talk to you a little bit more about what some of these things mean. I will note that if you notice the UL, urban low intensity, all of the districts that align with that LUDA begin with the UL. So it's very clear which districts are implementing that area on the LUDA map or the land use plan in the comprehensive plan. So this is covering the rural areas up to the urban low and urban medium, which is halfway to downtown, I'll say. Next slide. And then we get into the urban high, where we have, higher density, larger buildings, maybe mixed use buildings with residential on top and first floor retail. Parking is handled much differently. We have much different street types, wide sidewalks, on-street parking. And we work our way through the downtown district, those that are near or along transit stations or routes, and the opportunity that provides for walking in different development forms. And then getting into, the employment districts, offices and business parks to the heaviest and most intensive districts. Next slide, please. So this is a development that earlier it would simply say that attached, apartments or townhouses are permitted in this district. And there is a minimum setback of, like Marilyn mentioned, 25 feet, pretty common all across the city. And then, there's other standards that apply relative to, the building form and shape and landscaping and things of that nature. What we're talking about when I say bake in the standards, we'd be very, very predictable and purposeful in how we do that. We would say this housing type is permitted, rather than having a minimum setback, would have a maximum setback because we want to bring that building to the street. We want to create a walkable streetscape environment where you have front doors that, walk down onto the sidewalk. And we would spell out, what those dimensions are. How do we landscape it along the street? How do we landscape front yard areas or lawn areas. What does the roof type look like? You know, all those types of things we can spell out in that district. So when somebody makes an application, they know exactly what they're enabled to do in different parts of the city. So these are some of the metrics that we talked about. Amenity space we're utilizing that can cover a whole spectrum of different type of amenities, from the rural areas where that's essentially just wide open spaces, right? Where you might have floodplains, you might have ponds, open spaces, parks and greenways and lakes within neighborhoods and things of that nature. But when you come downtown, obviously we don't have room for those. So that amenity might be a plaza or some type of green wall or some other type of landscape treatment or urban design treatment. So they will kind of span the spectrum from that rural to urban. Density, Marilyn introduced to you the whole idea of density. And another one you haven't heard about yet is floor area ratio, which is basically the square foot of a building as a ratio of the lot size. So 1.0 would be, you know, a 2-story building built on 50% of the lot, or a 1-story building built on 100% of the lot. So that is a way that we can control bulk on a lot to make sure that we're not overbuilding lots, and to ensure that relationships between lots and compatibility between different lots are the way we want them to be. So the current requirements, I won't attempt to explain to you. I find them confusing. I've been doing this for 33 years. I know staff finds them confusing. So we're looking at delivering actually better outcomes than what you have been getting, but in a much simpler way by utilizing this amenity space. And some people might think, okay, well, if you're going to require more amenity space, then that means we're not going to have space for as many lots and as many houses. But we have accounted for that. So we make sure that as we are increasing the amount of open space for natural areas and, you know, vegetated tree stands and drainage ways and, you know, ponds and other retention areas and things like that, that we are compensating so that the same number of lots and even more lots can be achieved out of that development. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we proceed here. As I referred to, amenity space will be related to its context. So rural areas will be much different from areas, you know, on the edge of town, from areas downtown. The size will vary greatly. In an urban area, we have land is at a premium. So we utilize different design techniques and different types of spaces for that. They'll be clearly defined, they'll be illustrated, and you'll have a range of options. So it's not just, you know, all you can provide is A, but you might have A, B, C, D, and E, or some combination thereof. And all those will contribute to the overall aesthetic and the design of the community. So these are just more examples that, you know, could be anywhere from, you know, preserving a wetland or constructing a wetland, having trails along it that makes for a nice amenity. You know, having different types of ponds and rain gardens and different ways that we can collect and store and then convey stormwater, but creating those as an amenity at the same time. To different other improvements, such as, you know, street yards, the streetscape environment and how it's landscaped, and, you know, if you have planters or street furniture or decorative lighting or whatever that might be, and then buffers between different properties. So that's just a kind of a select few of the overall amenities that we expect to include in this code. So we talked to you earlier, Marilyn mentioned to you that there's different street types. So those street types will be integrated within this as well. Obviously, we don't want single family homes taking access to an arterial roadway. They should be taking access to a neighborhood street. And so that relates to a certain width of street, certain number of lanes, number of sidewalks, width of sidewalks, and how they relate to, you know, the front of houses. In the same way, when we get downtown, we have on-street parking, we have very wide sidewalks, and we have buildings built right to the sidewalk. So we have very different streetscape design. And so those will be worked into these districts as well. So just showing kind of a cross section, if you will, of what a 4-lane roadway looks like, whether that's 2 outside lanes for parking and 2 passing lanes in the middle with setbacks of the homes, and then showing it from a plan view. Also, you can see there's parking on both sides of the street and then 2 passing lanes. So that's the type of illustrations that Mark was referring to earlier to help illustrate and show people what these things are and how they apply. So the urban area is the first area that we will explore. When we say urban, normally you have larger buildings that are built near or to the street. They enclose the street to create kind of a street envelope so that there is a streetscape type of environment. When you walk in any one of your districts now, or when you walk in downtown, there's a much different feel, and it's designed much differently than it is out in the suburban fringe areas. And all those things relate to how we deal with parking, where it's located, what type of amenities there are, how big the buildings are, where they sit on the lot, how we think about designing these around a human scale. So they're not just massive buildings. They have no relationship to the sidewalk or passersby, civic spaces, and all these types of things that are considered and built into these districts. So this is the urban low. It is expansive. It's all the kind of beige or yellowish colored areas. It occupies the vast majority of the city. This includes, most of the developed and developing fringe areas where you're seeing a lot of your new subdivision development. They have it mostly curb and gutter streets, sidewalks, and varying densities and housing types. The plan, you see on the little box there on the left-hand side, tells you how it applies, what the purposes of it are. Then it'll give you kind of a density range. And that is 4 to 8 units per acre. So that basically tells you lot size or types of housing to reach that density. And then the bulk is what we talked about earlier, the floor area ratio. I know those are kind of foreign concepts, but hopefully you can understand them a little bit more as we proceed here. So desired outcomes that were articulated in Plan OKC is to increase densities where appropriate. There's some neighborhoods that have, blank lots, missing lots, or may have, tired or worn out buildings that could be redeveloped or repurposed. In those areas, the denser we are, the more efficient we are. We're utilizing the infrastructure that's already there rather than continuing to, sprawl outward. So to the extent that we can infill and have more buildings occupied and constructed within the center of the city or the areas nearer to the city, that's an opportunity. An accessory dwelling unit would be an example of a way that we can increase density, because we'd basically be doubling the density, the number of people that can live on a lot versus what can live there today. Integrate different residential unit types. We'll go through those. You'll see we'll have graphics like this that will help people understand how these different dimensions and measurements apply. When you see setbacks and heights and so forth, they will be illustrated. This is breaking down some of the districts. So the urban low, single family, you'd have single family detached and patio homes. There's possibility of adding accessory dwelling units. It's just determining where and how those could apply. And then the next step up would be a mixed residential urban low, where you'd start to have duplexes and townhomes and other attached types of units. And then we think about where those are related to one another and how they transition, so that your backyard doesn't line up right, behind a multiplex, but there's some type of transition, whether that's a landscape buffer or additional spacing or whatever that might be. Moving into the urban medium, we're coming closer into around the city center and around the downtown area shown on the map. These densities range up to 40 units per acre. So you start having, multifamily or mixed use types of buildings. One of the new concepts that has come forward is this idea of the urban medium single family C. That means conservation. So that's for the well-established neighborhoods that are stable, intended to be stable for the foreseeable future, and don't expect change. In other words, they don't intend to have redevelopment. They want to maintain the character and the use types, so that conservation district would allow that to happen. So the character remains the same, but yet allows, some flexibility. So if somebody wants to build onto their house, they're able to do so within certain confines that are spelled out in the code. And so there's not as many variances and processes that would be attached to that. So that is kind of a new addition that has come forward as we've gotten further and further into this process.
So does that mean that you would still have historic preservation
Absolutely.
on top of that?
Yes. I mean, you're going to have areas where you have, historic areas that are within districts. You're still going to have regulations that apply to the appropriateness of any improvements within those preservation districts. Good question. The rural approach, on the outlying areas where you're just starting to see some development, they may not have any infrastructure yet in terms of water and sewer lines, or they may be, being extended out that way. This is the rural area. So you can see kind of all the green areas around the edges, around the periphery. This would include the rural low and rural medium areas, the lighter green and the darker green. The plan OKC wants to make sure that things are compatible. You saw earlier PUDs, one of the big things that the reason why they're doing PUDs is to help transition between residential and commercial areas. So there's not, any negative impacts or undue impacts on neighborhoods from what might be building just across their rear property line or their rear fence. Thinking about ways that we can preserve and conserve environmental resources, floodplains, greenways, parks, and open spaces, and helping to reduce flood risk. So just kind of an image here on the bottom of what a cluster or conservation subdivision looks like, where the houses are clustered tighter together, but all of the open space around it is for the common use of those residents, and it will remain as open space in perpetuity. So they have the enjoyment, as Mark said earlier, of looking out their back window and seeing trees, and that will never change because what's over the property line they can't see. So that is what we're referring to as conservation development or cluster development. So this illustrates the concept. Whereas right now, these three different images would require three different zoning districts, meaning if you wanted to do one versus another, you'd have to go through the zoning process, go in front of the planning commission, notify surrounding property owners, go in front of the council, and that's going to take a specific amount of time. The way we're looking at it is all three of these would be permitted within the same district. So in other words, you could have large lots like the image on the left. And here they basically have privatized all the stream and the wooded areas the sea cut through. They're on private lots. So there's really no way to maintain that or to improve that over time. The next image in the middle shows how the same number of lots, the same number of houses have been clustered on smaller lots, but all the dark green areas around the periphery are these open spaces I was referring to that will remain that way forever. So therefore, the character of this neighborhood will never change because that's built in. The image on the left, the character may change if what's across the property line or adjacent to it, if they propose to come in with 5,000 square foot lots when they're adjacent to 2-acre lots, then yes, if that's approved, that can very much change the character. And then on the far right, again, we can start to introduce different housing types, some attached units, and provide the same and actually more units. So we're rewarding somebody for preserving open space, preserving these natural amenities, dealing with stormwater more effectively and efficiently, and creating different development forms by right without having to do a planned unit development. This is just another illustration that kind of shows, how the lots could be arranged, and there's less pavement, there's less lawn area, there's less water use, there's less fertilizer. So there's a lot of benefits that come from this. We're not requiring that anybody does this, but we're giving them an incentive and an option to do so without having to go through any additional process. So that is, I was going to say short, but it's fairly long-winded, actually. A 90-minute presentation. So I guess you've earned your credits. But at this point, we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, Brett, I'm going to recap our last slides to make sure we get to them. And then the rest of our time here, we can use on questions. Yeah, Mark, if you'll go to the slide after questions. There's 4 slides. I want to make sure I touch base on. So yes, stay informed. Like I said, this is going to be a long process. Beyond this meeting, you can go to okc.gov/code update, and that will have key dates. We have a section with past presentations, such as this one. In general, our cadence of the project going forward is that, at various stages, like right now, we're somewhere between input and review, right? And we're meeting with the public, with focus groups. We're meeting with industry such as yourselves to get input and feedback on the direction of the code. Oh no. Okay, there you go. And that will result in the first draft, and then that draft will be published online for the public to review and comment, including this group. And then with that information, we'll have more meetings with focus groups, residents, stakeholders, and then we'll have another draft. And with that draft, we'll address input and then circle around with policymakers. But the key point that this graph is trying to communicate is that at each of these steps, we have stakeholder input and a series of reviews before we move forward to the next step. And at every step, there's this just continuous feedback loop of what we're hearing. Next slide. Then, so our very next steps this summer, we're planning several kind of open house isn't quite the word, but we're going to go camp out at several of the public libraries for a couple of hours to talk to residents as they come through on their weekly library business. The mayor appointed a stakeholder advisory team that is charged with providing the design team with technical advice. And then throughout the process, we have various check-ins with Planning Commission and City Council. When they are public meetings, they are, of course, open to the public. And I think, is that it? Mapping. So yeah, so we have the LUDA map now, which is a vision. It's not zoning, but ultimately we'll need to have a new zoning map. We haven't gotten very far on, what will be rezoned into what, or if that will happen all at once, or if it will be piece by piece, we don't know. But I did want you to be aware that ultimately we're going to have a new zoning map, or none of the improvements we're trying to get to will be effective. And then, so Marilyn is our key contact. If you, like I say, you can go to okc.gov/code update. Do not hesitate to email Marilyn if you have just any questions, any pieces of advice. We will be sure and listen to it. So with that, we can back up to questions.
So I will point out that is a lot to absorb. I totally get that, but we felt we had to start somewhere. So this was going to be the first place. As Lisa pointed out, that moving forward, we also will be facilitating conversations in the summer and the fall as this process moves forward. And our hope is that you guys will help us in trying to engage in the conversation, because I got a couple of questions yesterday from people that were not here and says, so you're trying to tell me that OKCMAR is trying to put apartment complexes in my neighborhood? And I says, no, that's not the objective. The objective is to look at different way we approach how zoning is currently being done across the city. And with different factors, that would determine whether or not you get an apartment complex in your neighborhood.
Yeah, and
Dictate, what materials that you could use on houses. No, we're not doing that.
right. And my response when people ask me code questions at this point, well, can I have a quadplex in whatever neighborhood? And my answer is, well, it depends. How tall is it? How close is it to the street? What are you doing about parking? And for all the uses and forms, that's going to be our questions.
Okay, questions? Right there. Jessica's coming your way.
On the accessory dwellings, is there a proposed lot size that has to be on with an existing house already there?
Mark or Brett, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and I don't think we've gotten that far, but why don't you tell us?
We haven't written those standards yet, but I can tell you that most communities.
Volume.
Is that
hold
too
on.
loud?
No, we
you're
can't
too
hear
soft.
Oh, you can't hear me.
you. We can
better?
now. You're perfect.
Okay, great. Most cities that have introduced accessory dwellings into their zoning codes don't change the lot size typically, because there's several ways you can do this. One is you can have an accessory dwelling interior to an existing home, so that doesn't change any need for a lot size because it doesn't reconfigure your principal dwelling unit at all. Others in a more urban context sometimes allow, for example, a second floor above a detached garage. That usually doesn't change the lot size either. You would usually have a parking space or two in the back, maybe to accommodate the units, but it's very rare that the standards actually change or require a different lot size for them.
Next, right over here.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. Jessica.
For our developers who are planning, obviously what would be now referred to as a SPUD, within the LUDAs, obviously you guys talked about setbacks, whether they're minimums or maximums, building setbacks. Are there going to be other, I know not building materials, but like whether or not you can have a gated area or any of those kind of things, are those going to be addressed within the LUDA, or is that something the developer comes forth and asks for?
You're talking about a gated subdivision, for
Yes.
example?
Correct.
Yes, that's going to be in a part of the code called the development standards. So the way this is outlined, the first thing you're going to see when you crack the code is you're going to see a brief introduction, you're going to see the zoning districts, and then you're going to see an article that we call development standards that assembles things like parking and landscaping and things like that that are universally applicable to development around the city, although there may be differences depending on what district you're in, and what district you're in is driven by the LUDAs. So we haven't written the street design standards yet, or standards relating to whether you have gated communities or not. If it turns out that that's something the city wants to accommodate, then that's something we could accommodate, in the LUDAs, depending on what we're hearing from the general public. I've also worked in other cities where there's resistance to that, just because of providing services, connectivity between subdivisions, how the street systems work, and et cetera, that we could either address by through limitations or just by standards, like requiring a Knox box or something like that at the gate, so that it's accessible by safety services and fire and police and et cetera. So that's a conversation we're going to have a little later in terms of where they're allowed and how.
Answer your question? Next, other questions?
We're just going to clarify real quick on that accessory dwelling unit.
I was just wondering about like a mother-in-law home or something like that in the back of an existing residence that the lot size might be 100 by 120. Is there going to be a space requirement for that house to be built? I mean, accessory dwelling to me could be like a little apartment or studio or something like that.
Like, is there going to be like a lot coverage parameters?
Typically for,
Yeah.
typically for an accessory dwelling unit, you have, all of your setbacks for the principal dwelling, and the same would apply for an accessory dwelling if it is to be detached. So there are going to be setbacks from each of the property lines in a similar way. Generally, they also have a height limit as well. So you certainly don't want accessory dwelling that's larger than the principal dwelling on the lot. And then there may be a percentage of a rear yard. Sometimes communities will do that. They say only, 20% of a rear yard may be occupied, or they'll just say, the maximum ADU can be 600 square feet or whatever that is determined to be. But usually, to account for varying lot sizes like that, they don't just put a fixed number on it. It might be more of a percentage of the principal dwelling or percentage of rear lot coverage or something of that nature. So yes, there are dimensional standards. Then there's also probably some design standards to protect against privacy and things of that nature.
And to elaborate on that question, there are different types of accessory dwelling units. There's not just detached units, there's also attached units. So say you had a garage and you wanted to convert the attic space to a unit, you could potentially do that as well. So maybe in an area like low medium or urban medium level, kind of the outside of the urban core, where you have maybe you don't have enough room for a detached garage apartment, but maybe could convert the garage space above or even add on to the house. You could probably even do that with the ADU as well.
Other questions?
That's correct.
So I do have a couple of comments I'd like to throw out there. In some of the conversations that we've been having with the membership, some have said, hey, we have a real housing problem now. ADUs is a potential solution. Would the city be open to piloting some programs prior to the coding update? Or are we going to get pushback that, we really would like to wait? Your thoughts?
Yes, we have discussed internally, could we accelerate some portions of the code? It's not always that simple because so much of it is interrelated. The zone, the bulk standards are related to the street, are related to the landscaping, are related to the screening requirements. So it's always not that simple. But we are it's still a possibility, yes, that we could advance some of that.
Okay, and then some have noted that there is, with the market the way it is right now, it is really tough in order to get what we're going to call attainable housing for families to qualify for housing, because developers are not wanting to build a house that is less than $175,000. is the city looking again at the possibility of trying to maybe pilot some programs that would promote or incentivize developers to build homes that would fit with the, what was the number? 40% of the population that can't attain a home because it doesn't exist in Oklahoma City.
Right. I think some of that came out of the housing
Affordable,
studies,
yes.
and I didn't come prepared to report on any
No.
progress of that, but yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, lots of residents, industry folks. I mean, it's a big problem. What somebody forwarded in the office a recent article from, I don't remember who published it, but it was saying that it was something like, well, housing sales have slightly decreased in the last month or quarter, and that was partly because something like only 14% of home sales were under 300,000.
Yes.
So that's a issue.
Other questions, comments?
I've talked to somebody that says that with the city that said that we're going to build some structures for low income housing out of this new eco, brick and things like that. Okay. For keep bills low and all that kind of stuff. Those projects were supposed to be, I think, in some of the 13 opportunity zones that are available in the city right now. Okay. And that, so is that going on? One. And then also I heard that the funds that the city has for first time buyers and low income buyers is not being used because of the current market. They've got a lot of extra funds that they could loan people money, but they can't get the house bought because they sell so fast.
Sorry, could you repeat the first part of your question?
That's about the houses that were being built out of some new eco projects where basically they were concrete homes. And then they were foam insulated, and they were very, very efficient. And that was some of where the money was going to go. And I heard this from some people that had built the quadplex over at 27th. And that I think those originally sold for about 180,000. Those four, I think that was the number I heard. And then I heard one guy sold his for over 300 now. So, and he moved on. So, anyway, that's, are those eco houses being built as well? Are they being considered in this?
I'm not sure the extent, how many have been built in the city. The zoning code will address some design guidelines. Mark, I'm not sure how much we're going to get into materials if it's not in a historic preservation district.
Right. I would doubt that we're going to prescribe to that level for design, but what we're going to look at more is the orientation of the buildings, how they relate to the street in terms of their frontage types and how far back they are from the street, their massing in scale, maybe building composition. But I don't know that we're going to prescribe what kind of building materials they need unless it's in a historic district or historic overlay, which is one of the overlays that we still need. I think there are historic parts of the city, but I wouldn't see that as a base district requirement. So I've seen that kind of thing. I've seen houses built with the crates, those sorts of things in other places, even here in Kansas City. Container houses. So you're seeing a lot of creative things in other parts of the country and in Oklahoma City that I think that the new concept we're talking about can absorb pretty easily.
Marilyn?
I have a question for y'all since you're out there on the lines of all this is, if you could maybe kind of wave a magic wand, how would you make housing more affordable? Because it's a question that's hard to answer. So we can do incentives, we can say, well, if you do the, 10% affordable housing at 80%, MFI, then you won't have to plant 6 trees or what, we can only sort of do it that way right now. So
I
curious
hate to
what
put
y'all
a couple of people on the spot, but Kimberly, you've had some thoughts about this. I hate to put you on the spot, but now I'm going to let you talk to the public.
I don't know what I would say at this moment. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen, I think, that could alleviate our problem. But I think more than one player has to be involved. And so I think that's really what is wrong right now, is we're all sitting around talking about who's going to fix this problem when there needs to be more players involved. I think there's some younger development or some smaller developments that we can get involved that could build some of the houses that we need to sell. But a lot of times they're pushed out because of the larger developments, right? So I think a couple of things could happen. The city could get involved, but I think we should pull in more, some of those smaller developers can't develop a large neighborhood, but if we coupled them together, they partnered together, they could, right? And then they could do something that was on the lower scale. But anyway.
So thank
Don't
you.
put me on the
And
spot.
I'll bring it over here. What Kimberly is talking about, Marilyn, one of the things that we have found that the traditional developers or people that are established are the ones that are brought in for this conversation, and the city doesn't do an aggressive approach of looking to say, hey, are you wanting to be a developer? If so, come here and let us talk to you about the potential opportunities. And that was what I hope Kimberly would say more of, that she knows of. Yeah, she knows of developers, but they don't know, are not invited to the table because they don't necessarily have the established program that you guys normally look for.
We need all of those names and numbers.
Okay, thank you.
But on that note, we did, I think it was last summer, it might've been the summer before, summer 2021 or summer 2020, ULI hosted an incremental development workshop, and that had a lot of, were you part of that? Yeah. So it had a lot of smaller scale developers working at the neighborhood scale. And so Marilyn attended most of those. I attended some of them so that we could hear what everyone was dealing with. And it was basic zoning stuff that we already knew, like, you can't have 2 detached homes on one lot. Therefore, you have to do a spud or rezone, things like that, that we already want to address to get smaller homes that are more affordable. But yes, definitely push people our way on that.
Well, one thing I continue to see and notice is the price of houses under 200,000 cannot be built because the land is way too expensive. Another thing, what we could do is we could come in some of these blight areas that the city owns, have the city sell that land or keep that land, but have some type of incentive for building on those type of areas, cleaning these areas up that they aren't inhabitable, and turn them into homes that have the ability to be under that price point, because we're getting the land cheaper. If we get the land cheaper, we can build less expensive houses on it.
And are there some areas already? Yeah. So there are some areas.
Are you talking about JFK?
Yeah, in the Culbertson East Highland areas on the northeast side.
Okura owns many lots in JFK area, which is on the northeast side. And they several years ago did a set of design standards that try to set a vision for, hey, if Okura is going to give you or sell you this lot inexpensively, then you're going to maintain the prevailing setback. You're going to have garages recessed behind the front of the house. They're going to have porches, things like that. am not I don't work in that program. I'm not completely aware of why they haven't been able to
Kick off.
incentivize that development more. Do you know,
I think the biggest thing is construction costs have gone up, but for some of those areas, the people that live in those areas want to be a part of the process of what's happening in their neighborhood or community, what's being built. Does it conform with what is already there, or does it look completely modern? In those areas that we're talking about, they're, 1920s homes to 1950s homes. So for some of those people that live there, their big concerns are, the reason why Okura has those standards on what's being built there is they want it to conform to the neighborhood. So it keeps the neighbors happy. It doesn't feel like people are just coming in and telling them this is what we want to do and make a lot of money off of it. And also too, you can only sell to certain income. So there's income guidelines that you have to follow, which is really hard right now, especially because of construction costs. We all know. I think ultimately the solution is density. And, that's kind of a bad word. I think that we hear, or, people don't want density. Realtors don't want density in their own neighborhoods. And I think that's something that we have to change that conversation, because at the end of the day, we need density. We need affordable housing. That leads to the next tier of housing. That's how people move up from, their starter home to the next home. So we just don't have density right now. We don't have a diverse housing stock. We have a lot of single family, but not enough condominiums, townhomes. We don't have a lot of options for people.
So to build on what Jessica is saying, one of the things that we do realize, because she's correct, when we did our survey, we heard it loud and clear from the members that they weren't interested in that whole density conversation. But what we found, when you have a further, more detailed conversation, your idea of density has to be reimagined. There is a lot of innovative and different things that people are doing that you would look at and like, that's not quite so bad. That's not what I think of. I mean, just to use an example, when a lot of people think of density, they think of the apartments across the street. Right. Well, that is not all there is.
That's extreme density.
There is tons of different ways in order to get to density, and it doesn't have to be the apartment complex across the street.
Right, and the density, back to the comment about the cost of the land, that's like the only way you can start to make things affordable. And when I say there's like the legal definition of affordable housing, but I'm talking like people like me who work for a living. I'm just talking basic affordability that, if you can split the land costs among 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, okay, now we're getting to where real people can afford it.
One of the solutions we're looking at is a concept that Maryland.
Volume.
Oh, hold on just a second. We're going to turn you up. Okay.
Go ahead, Mark.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Marilyn mentioned in her terminology slide the concept of missing middle housing, and that does 2 things for us. Number one is it gives us a way to add density by introducing housing products that we haven't seen as much of in the past. The overwhelming product we see in Oklahoma City is your single family detached house, which is more expensive to build per unit than townhouses all the way up to apartments. So it gives us the density. But what the second thing it does, though, is it allows us to transition gently into single family neighborhoods, because what those neighborhoods often fear is an abrupt transition from what they have nearby to something that's a high rise or something that's grossly out of scale to what they have. With middle housing, you can transition using products that don't look very different from that single family home. And then as you get closer to something that's, for example, a busy corridor already, then you can put higher density products there where it makes a lot of sense. And so that's the thing that this middle housing concept, I think, gets us. And it's something we're trying to accommodate in a way that's easier to do than it is today. You don't have to beg for permission through a PUD. You don't have to rezone to a higher density district, maybe with some design features on your proposed development, whether it's better building design, whether it's providing open space in a way that makes more sense, in a way that's more creative than we've done in the past. We can absorb that into neighborhoods in a way that people haven't seen in Oklahoma City yet, or at least at the scale that we're looking at. There are examples. The Wheeler District, for example, is a brand new development that has a variety of those products. They have single family. They also have townhomes. They have apartments, all mixed in a small envelope on that site. So
See, and
So we
I
can
heard
see more
people
of it.
say, oh yeah, but Wheeler's not affordable. But believe it or not, there are affordable housing in the Wheeler neighborhood.
right.
Yes, they have a percentage exactly that have been set aside. So the first look would be, and that's a good thing, that, oh my God, I can't afford that. But then when you drive in there, there are affordable housing that are located in that neighborhood.
Not only did the Wheeler District do affordable housing, but they also did some mixed use spaces.
Thank you. Yeah.
They have a very creative, diverse number of housing, and it is something that we need to look at. They came in from outside of our environment and placed something in our environment that looks similar to what we're talking about in rezoning. I think we need to pay attention to it. There was some things that are well under 300. Of course, they just go fast.
Right.
Yes,
Yes.
I mean,
They're-
they're like
means
one
that-
bedroom, one bath unit.
they are small,
know.
but they did do some other opportunities where they have some garage apartments. There are some people who can live above some of their businesses. So it was just a look at how you can varying housing can put a lot of people in one space. Wheeler is housing more people than most neighborhoods, is what I'll say. And they are making it more affordable than we think they are.
So
Right.
part of our challenge is to educate and talk about these creative uses, especially these mixed use neighborhoods, that you can do that. I mean, it's not the solution to everything, but the key is that, say you live in far northwest Oklahoma City, people say, well, it's just going to be expensive out there. The land's expensive, the development's expensive. But you know what? There are people that work at those convenience stores, those gasoline stations. Well, you know what? They need to live out there because that's where they work. So you have to put some of that so that those very same people that work in those jobs can live close to where they live. So we have to be creative, and it is going to be different than the way we've usually have thought about what development should look like moving forward.
Right. The other thing I would add too is Wheeler needs competition to bring costs down.
Point well taken.
If Wheeler's the only game in town, prices are going to be higher. But there's another concept that's been talked about for a long time. Somebody earlier mentioned city-owned property and land banks. What Okura's doing is useful, but there's another supply out there that doesn't get talked about as much, and that's gray fields. That's some of these older shopping areas that have gigantic parking lots, right? And they're empty most of the time. What's a better use for that property? Empty parking spaces, or maybe we add housing and we start to piece projects like that together into what becomes a mixed use center.
So I
that's
hate to shut
another
it.
opportunity we can.
Yeah, no,
introduce.
thank you. I hate to shut it down. We got one more
Okay.
comment and then we're at the end of it. And I want to thank everybody for your patience. Go ahead.
Just real quick, how will this affect the current covenants and restrictions on properties?
Yeah, the question
will.
was, how will the new code affect current covenants and restrictions? I think the answer is
It
they will
won't.
remain, but I'll ask our land use attorney to to illustrate that a little further.
We're not. that?
Thank you.
Well, yeah.
But we would like going forward, we can't do anything going backward. We can't undo any of the PUDs. They'll all stay there. We're hoping that our zones will be so wonderful that they'll want to come in and pick a new one if they haven't developed yet. But we also in subdivision regulations want to make sure that we have some way of checking the new covenants that come about, that they're doable and protection for the residents, which we don't have a lot now. So we didn't really mention in this presentation that we are going to be changing the zoning codes, but we're also going to be rewriting the subdivision regulations. So that's rewriting the subdivision regulations. So that's will be a second piece, and that will have a lot of impact for out in the urban low and other places.
Final comments, Lisa or Marilyn?
No, thank you again. You have a handout. It's got Marilyn's contact info. Definitely stay engaged. And oh yeah, there's a if you go to the code update website, there's a link to sign up for email updates. And for all of us, because it's such a long process, that the updates aren't weekly, right? They're not even monthly. But when they do happen, they will be issued, and it is important that you pay attention to them and offer feedback when you can. So thank you.
Our plan is that for everybody that signed up, that is part of the class, we're submitting your email to them. So you also are going to be part of their update information. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Have a safe ride home.